And why don't we go ahead and get started? I suspect people will still be filtering in, but I'm Dee Dee Purshouse, and with the Land and Leadership Initiative, and also co-founder of the Can We Rehydrate California initiative, even though I do not live in California, but that was a audacious question, audacious goal posed by Walter Yena at the end of one of our conferences that he and I put on here in Vermont. And we then organized a tour, a speaking tour, talking about a kind of a more living systems view of water and climate in California back in 2017, 2018. And then because neither of us was traveling west during COVID, it kind of languished for a bit. And also California was very, very, very focused on carbon and soil carbon and drawdown during those years. But I think various things have brought the conversation back around to water, and Brock is definitely one of those leading voices in keeping water front and center in California and beyond. He's done tremendous work with Kate Lundquist and others on bringing beaver back to the West Coast and beyond. And that's decades of work. And now is got this new project at the Occidental Arts and Ecology Center, the Fuel to Flows program that we had a conversation with. It's on Substack. If you didn't catch that, I can put that in the chat. But I asked him if he would be willing to present in more detail about that, because I think it's one of those things where it's something that people can do, not without training, but it's definitely the kind of community action that I think has a lot of potential, rather than waiting for big policy to shift. And I'm pretty excited about it because I actually live in a gully here in Vermont. This week, about 18 people who are on retreat with me. We will be walking the gullies and going further upstream to look at potential places to do some of this work. I meant to take a few photos of my gully, but maybe I can find some. I'm sure you've seen plenty of gullies, Brock. But my road is a long few mile dirt road that is basically built at the edge of a gully that goes from 10 feet deep at the top to 25 feet deep further down, and we get flooding here in Vermont. So and a few years ago, the road crew thought they were being very helpful and cut all the trees at my part of the gully, so just destabilizing it a little further. So anyway, gullies are very much in my mind, as are check dams, et cetera, in terms of local resilience. And anyway, I'm super happy to have Brock with us here, and all of you, wonderful group. And we'll take it away.
Yay. All right. Well, thanks, Dee Dee, for hosting this, and just, your persistence over the years, and just convening these workshops, these conversations, groups of people thinking out of the box, or, just creative ways of action-oriented thought to, support us all in bringing regenerative solutions to the planet, ourselves, our communities, our watersheds. So thanks for that. And I know a bunch of names in the Zoom audience here, so kudos to all y'all. Nice to see you guys here. Yeah, I think since my bio was, in there, I don't need to dwell on that much, but I'm currently in Western Sonoma County, north of San Francisco, on the coast-ish there, Redwood Empire, although increasingly wine country. And I'm an endangered species vertebrate biologist, if you want to get into the technical training in that kind of world. And I would say after many years of working on environmental impact reports for California Environmental Quality Act documents, or National Environmental Protection Act documents, NEPA or CEQA documents, EIRs, on development projects, that to try to find the last frog, the last salamander, the last toad, the last marble murrelet, last spotted owl, those kinds of these iconic keystone critters or these imperiled critters, is that it became pretty evident to me in the late 80s, 90s that when the water cycle of a place was compromised through whatever action was happening, their land use development, resource extraction, typically, the carrying capacity for life was accordingly compromised. And so my conservation biology framework, which I did at UC Santa Cruz with people like Dr. Ken Norris and Michael Soule and others, um, is still at the root of my passion, my origin passion, but it's a lot of the work in the last 30 years at OAC has been framed under what I call conservation hydrology. And then there's and that kind of so the water game. So a lot. So I want to start off. Let me just shift over to the slideshow here. We'll share that. How's that look? We good?
Yep, that looks great.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, we're OAC, the nonprofit. This is our 31st year of being on this 80-acre property. We do lots of stuff. I'll let you guys look at the website there, but it's a organic farm retreat center. And then a couple of the programs I've been running for, decades now have been we have our permaculture resilient community design program. And then I have the Water Institute with Kate Lundquist, who's in the upper right there with me. And a lot of what we're going to talk about here is our projects, programs out of Water Institute, but also we have a wildlands program relative to the 70 acres of wildlands at OAC. And so the work we've done on the land and how that pushes outward, which is also what we'll talk about. So let's see. I just put in a few preludes here to basically say, let's start from the get-go and say, welcome to Planet Water. It's the only place in the known universe where water is life, meaning life is endemic to this planet. Thus, as a biologist, I'm super happy to be gainfully employed on this planet. Not interested in moving to the moon nor Mars. Certainly wouldn't want to go there with Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos anyway, but I'm happy if they would like to leave sooner than later, get the hell off this planet so we can get back to fixing up this amazing life-laden planet that I know we all love so much, but it's really the water planet and the recognition of that. And it's a pelagic planet. We should start off with that. It's 70% of this planet is pelagic. It's ocean, it's salt water. And that's running the show, and the majority of our oxygen comes from there, and the bulk of the water comes from there, and the temperature moderation on this planet comes from the ocean. We should all do our damnedest on behalf of ocean health, because that's the deal breaker. And yet there's this 30% of the terrestrial surface area that we get to interact with as primarily terrestrial bipedal sacs of saline solution working on our lands and the watersheds. This is a bit of a paraphrase from Jacques Cousteau, but this basic sense that the water cycle and the life cycle are one cycle. And I think that's really important. A lot of often people talk about sustainability, and unless they're telling me that they're striving to have the ability to sustain the cycles of life, I don't really understand what sustainability is ultimately about. And then the question of regeneration is what we're really up against. How do we regenerate? For many years, back in the late 90s, for a decade, I ran a training called Basins of Relations, starting and sustaining community watershed groups. And this is really this idea that, watersheds are these basins of relations. And then how do we rethink for restoration from the ridge to the river to the reef for this reverential and resilient rehydration revolution retrofit? And that's a whole other interactive thing that has a lot more to do with ecosystem restoration. How do we restore the ecosystem about our relations within our basins, as much as then getting to the quote ecosystem restoration or regeneration? It's a socio-political, cultural, spiritual conundrum I think we're all facing. That's the pandemic, it seems to me. And I often play with the idea that our watersheds, these basins of relations, kind of look like lifeboats, if you will, from stem to stern and ridge to river. How do we rethink and retrofit within our living lifeboat? And it's an all hands on deck moment, watershed by watershed, within bioregion by bioregion, or continent by continent. And so that as a frame to conceptually think about. And sure, as Dee Dee mentioned, lots of us throughout the planet are dealing with drought, extreme drought. This happened to be a photo of Governor Newsom, back 4 years ago or so in one of the big reservoirs up here in Northern California, Lake Mendocino, having a wonderful press conference on that cracked mud there about the historic drought at that point. Interestingly enough, just 2 years before that, we were in the midst of deluge, and this is a shot of the Russian River way out of its banks and flooding into the local movie theater in the town of Monte Rio. The fact that they have a smile, it's free thing on their banner at the time I took the photo, I don't think was intentional, but yeah, it's a little bit unfortunate. But yeah, apparently denial, is not only a river in Egypt, it's kind of a river in most of our watersheds, and how this is degree to which we're collectively in denial. I will say for those of us on the West Coast, not just California, but across the Pacific Northwest, the big water cycle, because I know we have a lot of small water cycle folks in this crew, but the big water cycle that runs the show in this region is our ocean waters coming to us from the ocean, from the Pacific, and related to how the jet stream's working and that. And it's especially related statistically, volumetrically linked to these atmospheric river events that we get out of. Oftentimes, we had 4 of them this last year. And these are crazy things. And yeah, imagine 50-mile wide river up in the sky that over 3 days can drop the total volume of water as if there were 15 Mississippi rivers dumping on your head. And how the orographic effect for us works with our coastal mountains, and then obviously how the Central Valley rain shadow piece works. And then we've got the big wall of the Sierra Nevada, right? The longest contiguous mountain range in the lower 48 states, 400 miles plus, rising up, 14,000 on Whitney, but 13, 10s, 12s. And that wet western slope and the eastern dry slope. We have the second snowiest place after Mount Baker in the US, up off Lassen Peak, that averages 50 feet of snow a year. I've seen up to 65 to 70 feet of snow a year, and it's heavy, wet Sierra cement. It's not that light powder in the Wasatch or the Rockies. And it runs the show for the water supply in California, historically, naturally, and also in this modified landscape. I think it's fair to say that California is likely the most hydrologically modified place on the planet relative to the number of dams and canals and associated reservoirs and aqueducts and pumping and all of that kind of stuff. So how we interact with the big water cycle when it comes to us in the winter, which is a Mediterranean climate, it comes to us in the cold part of the year, and we get a whole lot of water. And then as Gary Snyder said, for those of us who live in the Sonoma County area, we are basically where Canada and Mexico meet. And so we are the southern tip of the contiguously connected coniferous corridor to Canada, right here in West Sonoma County. And so we're literally the Pacific Northwest rainforest. OAC, we average 60 inches of rain. We've had a number of years with 100 inches. Remember, global average rainfall is 15. And yet we're going to get a 8 to 9 month dry season out of that in the summer, where we don't get any, it's very rare, if ever at all, any sort of measurable precipitation from rainfall. But we do have this really cool fog cycle that is a whole other thing from a hydrologic perspective of an income side of the water budget during our Mediterranean dry season. So for many years, I've been working, I think, especially in the permaculture world and such, thinking about what now would be called maybe more stormwater management or low impact development, and the recognition that whenever you get that water coming out of the sky, and as in rain or fog, or to the degree less so with snow melt from a quote stormwater perspective, so it's really about rainfall for the most part. Do you perceive that stormwater, that rainfall, as a problem to pave, pipe, pollute, and plunder, or do you perceive it as a solution to slow it, spread it, sink it, store it, share it? And so in this framework I created more than 20 years ago of the conservation hydrology and how to receive, recharge, retain, release, and think about water budgets. It's really about patterning land use, patterning land surface to be receptive, if you will. And so do we live in the drain age, the age of draining everything, or do we live in a retain age? And I think a very old friend of mine, and I'm sure many of you all on the call here, Brad Lancaster, who we were friends before he became famous with his books, and was engaged with him a lot on that. But I love all the graphics in his. If you don't know Rainwater Harvesting for Drylands and Beyond's, his 2-volume set, then you can't imagine anybody in this group doesn't know that. But and so just this idea of what does it look like to respongify in a development paradigm, whether that's urban, rural, suburban, forestry, rangeland, tillage, ag, or not. Every land use sector, I believe, has its portfolio of responsibility to retrofit. This phrase, slow it, spread it, sink it, store it, share it, if you want to play it all the way out. I don't know. I came up with that in the early 2000s. It's taken off. Lots of folks use it. Here's 4 different guides from 3 resource conservation districts in California, and the Okanagan Basin Water Board for basically the province of British Columbia has been putting it out for a while. So all that's to say, I'm just my prelude here before we get to fuels to flows is just been doing a lot of thought about human land use, settlement, impervious surfaces, and runoff coefficients, and how do we modify and mitigate those impacts strategically at scale. We on our 80 acres at OAC in Sonoma County have been doing lots and lots of interventions since we moved here in 94. This is a couple photos of some different versions. The thing on the left there is my interdigitated ditches where I'm taking water off the county road, but I don't have a long linear space to put in a big swale. So it's just a series of crenellated little small mini basins that I keep pulling water out of. Otherwise, the county road ditch. But there's lots of versions of that. I don't know how many, she had a half a mile worth of swales at OAC at this point. One thing that's noted, and you can download this integrated stormwater retention guide, which we did back in, I don't even know, 2010 or 12. But we put a pressure transducer in our well, and it's fascinating to look if you nerd out on that graph in the upper right there, where at the end of the year, and that section of the graph where you have rainfall on the vertical axis and then time on the horizontal there, that our well sits on the bottom and it basically bumps along for 8 months or so, or 7 months with very little water. And then we got a couple measurable rain events there you can see, which wasn't more than a couple inches. And we 2 inches of rain after dry season on our fractured Franciscan rock went down, and we recharged over 100 vertical feet within a day. Look at that graph. And so we have this highly porous, leaky landscape that's really connected surface to groundwater on the order of 100+ feet within days,
Wow.
which is quite impressive and disconcerting for folks relative to water quality and groundwater protection, the capacity to convey pollutants from the surface to the ground. But it also implies that we don't have a very durable storage capacity here with our interstitial water. So we need to slow spread and sink and responge soils a lot. Not to go into this could be a whole show, but I think what many of us know in the watershed world is, and this wonderful mentor of mine, Danny Hagens from Pacific Watershed Associates, would say is that nothing in nature mimics a road. And I think literally your first cut, if you look at the hydrologic condition and stability, the capacity to rehydrate or not, in a watershed is a map that would look at the road density layer. And that's all manner of roads, from big paved ones to rural ranch roads to even the legacy haul roads and skid trails from our logging area. And roads, there's nothing deranges and degrades watershed conveyance ratios and more intense than the road game. So this book on the left, Handbook for Forest, Ranch, and Rural Roads, is a free downloadable PDF. It's a nearly 2-inch thick guide. In California, it is the document that if you were to get any public money from State Department of Fish and Wildlife to do fish-friendly roads, all of the prescriptions or the specifications that you would be funded to do are scoped in this document. And it's kind of everyone should just have this thing, because we start with the dispersed sheet flow, the uplands, what I was talking about, the stormwater stuff. But then at some point you got to deal with the roads and the nexus to the roads. And then also the work of Bill Zeedyke and others, Van Clothier and others out in the Southwest desert country. Bill Zeedyke is an amazing character. Let the Water Do the Work is another wonderful book of his. But this idea that water harvesting from roads versus water roads as drainage and dehydration structures, I think is just a critical piece of the puzzle and often gets us to where we're headed, which is the gullies. um, and I'm just a fan of, I think, Luna Leopold, who's one of the children of Aldo Leopold and his wife there. And he was an emeritus professor in geofluvial morphology out of UC Berkeley, passed some years ago. But I love this quote of his that the health of our waters is the principal measure of how we live on the land. And to the degree that health is somewhat understood in the water space, that there's two Q's in water, there's quantity and there's quality, and the relationship of those two Q's in your area, drought and flood, the quantity question, but the quality of pollutants in that, surface to groundwater being connected, flow regimes, all of that stuff. And so measuring health, and then looking for indicators of health that tell us that. And for us in the Pacific Northwest, in Salmon Nation, salmon is one of our primary indicators, our so-called canary in the watershed coal mine. And where I live in the Russian River Basin. We have Chinook salmon, steelhead trout, and coho salmon. They're all anadromous fish. They're born in freshwater, go to saltwater, get big, return to the freshwater, spawn and die. Steelhead trout don't necessarily die their first round. And by the early 2000s in the Russian River, we were down to 6 to 12 individual coho salmon. Extinction was pressing, and it was a full court press. Excuse me. And so many of us have been working on this for decades around salmon restoration and dam removal. Yay, Klamath dams are out. It's incredible. Fish-friendly roads, in-stream structures, habitat, off-stream storage, in-stream flow augmentation, all these interesting projects to recover salmon. And in fact, a group of us spent a decade in ultimately 5 tributaries, but we developed 4 of these stream flow improvement plans for watersheds within the Russian River Basin. And I would recommend folks, if you don't live, even if you don't live in one of these 4 basins, pull one of these up. OACs in the Dutchbill Creek watershed, and have a look at the framing and the strategies, the science behind it, and also the suite of solutions that we're working on as a group. Because what became really clear after we've done all the other work to allow fish to get in and have habitat and spawning gravels and reduce sediment and erosion and that kind of stuff, is that lack of in-stream flow in the summer to fall for the rearing baby fish who were born in that creek and are waiting for the first rains to head out to the estuary to smolts and go to the ocean, that our creeks go dry, that they go intermittent, that the water quality, dissolved oxygen, pH gets really bad. And that's a critical limiting factor in the survival and reproduction of our salmonids. And after a decade of really head down focused work in these creeks, but I think everybody had was the watershed moment, which some of us had been yelling about in the beginning, was that you can focus on the creek as much as you want, but you won't get there until you work from the ridge all the way to the river. And it's actually the fact that in any watershed, less than or roughly 10%, depending 15% of the surface area of any watershed is actually the waterway, the drainage area. Blue line streams, if you take a watershed map and you put a blue line stream on a USGS map, and you tell me how much ink it took to ink in the blue line versus the ink of everything that isn't a blue line, you're using less than 10% of ink on that blue line. So they're hypercritical. These fish-bearing waterways are keystone systems, and yet their health is the principal measure of how we live on the land. And it's the uplands that if we don't solve for upland integrity simultaneously, we won't get there for the fish. This is something we've worked at a lot. This is a poster that's in downtown Occidental that we put together, focusing on Dutchbill Creek watershed and a whole timeline and different things. And this show is being recorded. This poster is on OAC's website. You can download it and nerd out on all the words and things. But just to say, lots of work has been happening on that. Published several peer-reviewed papers on this question about trying to figure out restoring summer base flow and a decentralized water management regime. We're talking about we're in rural areas. We're not in big municipal centralized water systems per se, although there's critical work to be done there as well. And part of that awakening, and for me as a beaver lover for a long time, I started kind of pushing this question in the late 90s and 2000s in California and got nothing but beaver haters and beaver deniers for a long time, I will freely admit, till roughly 2012 when I got an award from the Salmon Restoration Federation called the Golden Pipe for introducing innovation by bringing in beaver to salmon restoration. We published our first peer-reviewed paper on historic ecology of beaver in the Sierra Nevada, which pushed against the narrative that beaver were non-native for the most part in California, were a nuisance. My beaver flag thing came out in that year, and we really kicked butt. And then it took us a decade to move our campaign forward, but we've really been doing a lot of education outreach, citizen science, the research demonstration, the policy change. And I will say that based on Governor Newsom in 2022, he created a beaver restoration program. We now have a standalone program in our California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And in fact, about 18 months ago, the first two translocations of beavers in almost 75 years in the state occurred. The first one is in this beautiful meadow called Tasman Koyom in collaboration with the Mountain Maidu people of the Maidu Summit Consortium. And then some months later, another one happened in the Southern Sierra with the Tule River tribe. And the beavers in Tasman, for instance, CDFW just released a beautiful video on International Beaver Day about a month ago, showing the success of those beavers that now have two families, and that meadow is completely wetted and beaver filled, and it's just gorgeous, and they're doing amazing work. So the beaver game is really fun. It's really interesting. And in the riverscapes, it's really critical. But again, beaverscapes and riverscapes in any watershed likely don't represent more than 10% of the surface area. In fact, there's often the phrase some of us quote about the estimate at time of contact in North America, where there was 60 to 400 million beavers, and the estimate is said to be that 10% of the continent was under, quote, beaver water, which is an amazing thing. But again, honoring that 10% as really badass 10%, but then the other 90% of the uplands, I think, is what's kind of been orphaned in many people's minds, I think, for a long time. A number of us working in the restoration space, especially here in California, have increasingly been less enthused with maybe more of the form-based restoration, we might call it, that's focused on nouns and materials and very rigid structures, and imposition-based restoration versus composition with. So do you compose with or impose upon is one of my permaculture principles. And so a number of years ago, a subgroup of us from various federal, state agencies, NGOs, tribal groups created the California Process-Based Restoration Network. We have a website. We do a bunch of work. There's a series of some papers from some of our founders, Damian Ciotti and Jared McKee, Karen Pope, Matt Kondoff, Michael Pollack. People know their names if you want to look at that design criteria thing. And a lot of that is really looking at, again, in the space, in the riverscapes, if you will, are the acronym of STEM, which I know is also in school a different acronym, but we're really trying to think as verbs, as process, and ask the question in any system you're working at, what is the space? What is the process space? What's the process time? What's your process energy? And what are the process materials? And then how do we work with those systems in both the abiotic sense, if you will, and obviously ultimately the biotic relationship, which is where beavers obviously shine as not just nature's engineers and foresters and farmers and masons, right? But just as keystone species in the definition of what a keystone species would be, which is a species in an ecosystem whose presence disproportionately benefits that ecosystem to a much larger degree than they themselves need. And so a lot of work in the PBR, LT-PBR, low-tech process-based restoration space. Lots of folks at Utah State University have been really leading the way on this. A number of the folks on that LT-PBR Riverscapes design manual, Joe Wheaton and Nick Bowist and Stephen Bennett and a number of folks that have been working on that. And so if you haven't downloaded this LT-PBR guidance manual, I would highly recommend it with the roads manual. These go together. We fix our roads up, and then we can work on the riverscapes in an LT-PBR space. And what's been fun in our Cal PBR network is we've been hosting these hands-on trainings in the last bunch of years, and that we call them Build Like a Beaver. And you can see there's lots of folks. We have up to 50 to 70 folks at a time. We're camping out for a week, doing work. This was work in that same meadow the beavers went in, Tasman Coyon, which is in the North Fork Feather system up near Lake Almanor, Chester, for people who know California, northeastern kind of area. And a lot of this work is this fuels to flows work. So you can see that there are encroaching, in this case, lodgepole pines. There's fire in the background in that upper photo. And as these meadows were, the beaver were taken out, and the meadow got to a single threaded channel, which it never had, which then began to incise, and it dewaters the meadow, and the meadow moves from a wet meadow to a dry meadow, and then you get sagebrush or conifer encroachment or other things like that. And so the process of thinning out that encroaching material and placing it in the waterways to re-upgrade and rehydrate and re-elevate the base elevation of water and spread it out and hold it on the land longer, re-wet those peaty carbon soils that were being oxidized into the atmosphere. In prep, in some cases, in Tasman, as a pre-beavering exercise to the reintroduction of beaver, is a really wonderful process. And it's really fun to do, and it's not that hard. In last year in 2024, we did another one in a series of meadows, and there's camping out, there's great food, and so the next one for anyone who's interested in this is actually going to be this fall in October on the east side of the Sierra Nevada in the Carson watershed in a valley called Faith Valley. So if you'd like to attend that, they're very affordable. We try to make it affordable. Go to the Cal PBR network website, and pretty soon I think the specs on that will happen. So I want to pivot to, as we're moving, kind of the thinking like a watershed, the basins of relations, the stormwater management, the nothing in nature mimics a road question, the beaver scapes, the river scapes. At some point, California is 100 million acres for what it's worth. So Rehydrating California is, as Dee Dee said, the ambitious and audacious proposal here is like, oh man, it depends on that one. But this came out here this last year by the governor, Newsom, talking about the nature-based solutions targets for carbon neutrality. And this recognition, they're saying, of 33.5 million acres are, quote, at risk of wildfire, and nearly 12 million acres of forests need issues addressed. And when you look at some of the details of how they plan to, say, manage or reduce the wildfire risk, it says they're mostly through beneficial fire, prescribed fire, cultural fire, which is great. And then the forest stuff is talking about managing for biodiversity, carbon, and water supply protection in relationship to fire. So what I find interesting is that's a lot of acres in need of what is known as vegetation management. And that process of vegetation management in modifying the fuels that people perceive as so flammable in prep to either bring beneficial fire in or otherwise, is that's tons, literally millions of tons. If we're talking 33 million acres, it's probably a trillions of tons of slash ain't trash. It's a beneficial biomass. And my question is, what's the plan to balance the beneficial biomass budget with this once in a generation organic waste that's not waste, it's a resource, in addition to beneficial fire. And so my thought is it's time, let's make haste with zero waste, because it's time to connect our fire fears with our water woes by turning them fuels into flows. So California put a lot of effort in came out in 2022 with this strategic plan for expanding the use of beneficial fire. And I will say that I've been pushing pretty hard the last few years on my fantasy would be to have a parallel document that I've modified here. This isn't a real document that's expanding the use of beneficial biomass. And I'm saying it'd be great to get that done by March 2026. And this is sort of the pivot to the piece of work here. So we know in California, like many Western states that are fire dependent places, that in the Euro-Pyro illiterate settlement pattern that said no fire, NO to fire, in fact, made Indian burning some of the first laws on the books in California were outlawing those dirty Indians from using fire that they're addicted to. And so we went from a indigenous burning place that has been estimated to have 4 to 11 million acres a year were being burned by native burning pre-contact. So 10 million acres is 10% of the state every year. Imagine that for the folks who live here. To a not letting anything burn, fire suppression, smoky bear fetish. And so we moved into a low frequency of fire, which has driven this high frequency experience of catastrophic mega fires, away from the high frequency of burning, resulting in a more low intensity experience. And this is some controlled burning. We've been doing at OAC since the late 90s, actually. Um, Burning that. And we actually recently just did a wonderful burn project in 2022 with an amazing group of folks at Audubon Canyon Ranch called Fire Forward. And this project is related to what I'm going to talk about in a bit with the funding we got to do our forest health fuels to flows projects. And so on a 4-acre understory burn of Oaks Madrone Bay with some redwood and Doug fir mix, we limbed and thinned the forest as per our fuels to flows process, and we stuffed all of our incised gullies with that organic matter. And then we brought fire in underneath in that system. We back burned away from the gullies so that we didn't burn them out. And then we had our carbon catcher's mitts in the gullies to receive the increase in runoff with ash mobilization in that first rainfall post fire. And it's a perfect combination as a sequence of an order of events. So the burn boss in this case was also being led by me as the biomass boss. And I'm really pushing that we need biomass bosses almost first and foremost. A burn boss is just a biomass boss who sees that organic matter is combustible. A fuels to flows burn biomass boss also sees that compost. So combustion and compost are two opportunities to interact with this organic matter. And I get to that because I think it's important to recognize that on planet water, we live on a planet that's carbon-based life, but by volume, when we're healthy, we're mostly water. And so I think there's a lot of appropriate recognition, especially in folks who kind of are woke to climate change, greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere driving the fossil fuel fetish is driving this global fossil fuel fever, if you will. And so sequestration, oh my God, plants, photosynthesis, actually, it's actually bacteria, mostly in the ocean, that are doing this work. And we're the first ones to figure out this cool trick of turning sunlight into sugar. Algae got it next, and then plants got it third. And then us animals and fungus are then riffing off of the outputs of those autotrophs, if you will. And so this whole equation of the photosynthetic equation is an amazing thing that I think we all need to be really reminded of, because we love the output of oxygen to take a breath on, and we love the sugar output, that carbohydrate, if you will, that comes out of these processes based on sunlight. But it's really tracking that there's two equal inputs, if you will, into this idea that energy flows, matter cycles, and life webs. Dr. Art Sussman's wonderful little phrase there. And the matter inputs are equal with respect to 6 molecules of CO2 and 6 of H2O of water. And it's the atmospheric CO2 that I feel like a lot of folks get fixated on because they want to have less of it in the air and they want to convert it to more in the soil, which I'm completely into. But the fascinating piece about this is that CO2 is not the limiting factor in the capacity to drive this equation. It's actually H2O. And if you don't believe it, well, let's just take a quick look at California and the 100 million acres and the water resources in this map on the right-hand side, where you can see at the top where the little like light pink color is indicating parts of the state that get up to 200 inches of rain on average, versus at the bottom in the red is less than 5 inches. So we're either, we're way down in the Mojave Desert in the Laria tridentata creosote bush zone, or we're up in the far northwest in the Great Pacific Northwest rainforest of the redwoods, the highest standing carbon biomass of any terrestrial forest on the planet when it's intact. And the spread between that from 200 inches to 5 inches is incredible. The east side of the Sierra is an amazing thing. The west side of the Sierra is a thing. The Delta is a thing. The South Coast is a thing, like the Modoc Plateau versus the North Coast. And so when we talk about rehydrating California, my head spins because the "it depends" answer. But what I can tell you is CO2 proportionally, all things considered, is basically equal across that spread. And you tell me about the soil carbon in that desert Mojave soils versus the redwood forest. The water runs the show. and then carbon follows water. And then the beautiful virtuous cycle is that once you get carbon in the soil, then it holds more water, and then we get that wonderful combo. So it's a both and, but if you ain't got the water, you can't drive the plant biomass processes. So that kind of gets me into this idea of, again, if energy flows and matter cycles and life webs, and especially right now in California, what I'm witnessing is the majority of interaction with vegetation and landscapes in a forested, a woodland, chaparral, grassland space, not thinking about, say, rangelands explicitly, although there's a Healthy Soils Initiative and the Marine Carbon Project and Carbon Cycle Institute and compost for rangeland soils and tillage ag soils. But these other, quote, native vegetation habitats, fire is driving and people are managing vegetation at scale. And for the most part, the ethos is that the output of that management, that slash is trash. And how do we pivot to seeing it as a beneficial biomass, which I think gets me to this, my sort of rainbow sense here of the elementals of fire, earth, water, and air, and how they create conditions conducive for life. And there's a whole bunch and this is not even enough logos of federal and state county agencies that have mandates that are often siloed. And so there's the fire folks have their fire goggles on, and that's what they see. And maybe the soil people have their soil conservation goggles on, and the California Air Resources Board has their air goggles on, and the water quality quantity people have their goggles on. I'm interested in a set of rainbow goggles, and that we see the full spectrum, and that in these projects that CAL FIRE funds the forest improvement, veg management, and we get NRCS to fund the erosion control sediment process, and we get the water board to fund water quantity, we get CWW to fund the salmon restoration, we get California Air Resources Board under our AB 32 Global Warming Solutions Act to fund the mandate that is helping sequester carbon that they're on the hook to deal with, and that we need this integrated, holistic, bureaucratic integration. It's an intersectional opportunity here. So in thinking like a watershed, and as a permaculture designer, if you will, and strategically starting at where do you start? It happens to be that OAC, which is on the right, that's a LIDAR layer of the 80 acres. We are an upland property. We don't have any perennial waterways. We have no fish-bearing waterways, what are known in our Forest Practice Act, if you will, as Class 1, which is a fish-bearing waterway. We don't even have Class 2, which is non-fish-bearing but has aquatic invertebrates or maybe herps, amphibians. We're basically what are known as Class 3s, which in the stream order classification would be known as first order. So ephemeral, intermittent, seasonal streams, they run when it rains, they deliver sediment down low, but they're not year-round streams. In any watershed, even my points earlier about, say, 10-ish% of a watershed area is the drainage network. Within that, the first order streams generally represent at least 7 times the linear length in an area than do any of the perennial waterways. So if we think about your aorta versus your capillaries, these volume of capillaries in your system compared to your primary aorta or your vena cava, if you will, your carotid, it would make sense that it's not to say any work better or worse, but they're just different in scale. And so what we faced when we first moved our property in 94 is images like I took here, picture from the early 2000s, but of a landscape, in our case, that had been clear cut 3 times over and then had been fire suppressed. And there is no actual modern fire within settler history here in the last 140 years. So there's been 0 fire through these systems. And so we've been fire suppressed in a clear cut scenario. And interestingly for us, Douglas fir, which is an incredible native tree, which I deeply love. And OAC is the southeasternmost known distribution for the Sonoma tree vole in North America, which is an arboreal obligate mammal that lives its whole life up in Douglas fir. So it's not about getting after Doug fir, but it's about size of trees versus quantity of trees. And we probably went in these forests from 500 trees per acre to these photos are showing 15 to 2,000 trees per acre, many of which are stem excluding and they're half dead. They have all the dead limbs, the fire ladders, the fuel load. They're impenetrable to everybody, especially things like spotted owl. In this day, we did not have spotted owl on this property when it looked like this. I will tell you, after we did a bunch of work, we had them breed here for 12 years because of the work we did to open it up. So my mantra for many years has been fewer trees and more forest, and trees as nouns and forest as verb. And it's really about quantity and quality relative to relationship. And so this frame of thinning, which I want to say is there's also the less trees, less forest and industrial, extractive, especially what we see on our public lands, I think a lot right now, Forest Service, BLM lands where there's an industrial partnership. The bill that the forest bill that's out right now is really promoting that industrial extractive forest as commodity. And so I want to really differentiate that when what I'm going to show you in the relationship to forest health and the care and the connection and the work we're doing in these systems bears zero resemblance to what we witness in an industrial framework of of industrial extraction of quote thinning, or the worst case scenario is the world of salvage logging, where in that truck up there after a fire here, they're literally removing living redwoods that are going to resprout because they got a little burn scar on them because it was a cheap way to avoid the rules through an emergency exemption and log places off. And so I get it. And what's happening in the Sierra Nevada and many of our mountains in the Western states, and with Trump's new order to basically cut, baby cut, and increase extraction, is a shit show, and we should all fight against it. And anything I'm talking about here doesn't have that relationship. But I find that there's the the pendulum swing from the touch too much crew, the clear cut crew, the take it all crew, and then the pendulum swings to the love it, leave it alone, let nature heal itself crew, which often looks like no interaction with the forest, but yet fire suppression is still happening. And both of those are degenerative disturbances, in my humble opinion, in a system that's trying to recover from having been raped and plundered for so long. So how can we show up as keystone species with humility to help thin and limb towards old growth again, where we're not taking out the whopper trees that whatever that system's grown. It's not about merchantable timber. It's not about board feet. It's about spacing and ability to return good fire that has a lower intensity with higher frequency and return the rehydration state of our uplands and the carbon sequestration in our soil sponges and that kind of a system. So towards that, we put together a stewardship plan back in 2015. It was funded by our California Forest Incentive programs with support with the Natural Resource Conservation Service. You all can look this up. It's 200 pages. It's very detailed. For the permaculturalists in the house, it's a very fat 200-page wildland permaculture plan that's highly integrated. I published a number of papers in different journals on this stuff. And so we're really facing is after, again, I showed you we've been addressing our stormwater, slow it, spread it, sink it, store it, share it. We did fish-friendly roads and reshaped all of our roads with outslopes and rolling dips and culvert protection and hardened fords. And then we got after all of the drainage networks. We have 11 class 3 sub-tributaries that drain off the property that all lead to the Coho and Steelhead stream a half a mile away from us. So we basically, on behalf of our fire fuel load concern, but also my Coho concern with our gullies, created what we have been calling, it's our gully stuffing is a nature-based solution for upland. So we've moved into the upland scape. We got to work in the riverscape, the beaverscape. We got to do all that work, the estuary scape, but we also got to work in the upland scape. And how do we use this fewer trees and more forest with some good fire to get that cleaner water while we sequester carbon? And so how do we spare the air while we stuff the gully to save the salmon and the salamander simultaneously? A lot of that looks like these first entries into these overstocked forests. I should have had the before photo here but we kind of saw it. It was a complete dog hair thicket. It's impenetrable. You couldn't crawl through it. So there's thinning happening there where you're taking out certain trees. There's limbing of the fire lever of the trees that remain. If you look above the pileated head on the upper left there, you can see we actually climbed some trees and we lopped them high so they'll die in place to make snags for that pileated to come back in, or a number of other species. And then what do you do when you, after you've disconnected the ground fuel from the crown fuel with all that organic matter and from the limbing and thinning? And if there's, if you don't have a gully nearby and you don't have that much of it, you can lop it, you can scatter it. But a lot of it for us, we start with the adjacent fuel loads to our waterways that need up stabilization. So while there's limits to growth, my humble opinion, we can also limit for growth, right? And and so the main angle I've been working on with our fire folks is that before we bring prescribed fire in, beneficial fire in, again, this idea that slash ain't trash, it's a beneficial biomass. And so can we pair up the honoring of this organic matter from that amazing process called photosynthesis that has accumulated in our forest because of the response to the legacy of clear cutting and fire suppression? But let's honor it. Or we, in this, in the lower left, they're actually using invasive Scotch broom as part of a management process to stuff gullies with, so that we can stack functions in the permaculture vernacular with on-site resources in a relative location kind of idea, and do that work. Here's a photo at a state park where they did a typical prescription of limbing and thinning, and then they make these little burn piles all over. And then the effort and time it takes to make the burn pile is a lot. Then they will have to bring a second crew back sometime in the winter when it's a spare the air day and spend their time burning that off. What it took for them to avoid the gully here seems to me quite amazing in this location. And so while I've burned thousands of piles, I'm not saying we shouldn't do burn piles, but in the relative location where you are adjacent to an opportunity to stack functions, to slow water, to clean water, to upgrade channels, to increase upland rehydration, and use that material to stuff gullies, that would be, in my humble opinion, a much more regenerative rehydration strategy. That waterway is considered a waters of the state in these first order systems. And so you need permits to fill those waters of the state, which we got. We were the first kids in the block to get those at the state starting in 2001. We had to get a North Coast Regional Water Quality Control Board permit. For the nerds out there, it's called a 401 for fill permit. And we had to get a lake bed stream alteration agreement, or 1600, from Department of Fish and Wildlife. What we didn't have to get for the permit geeks, and I won't go too deep here, is a 404 fill permit from the Army Corps of Engineers at the federal level, because under the Trump rules, which have now become the, through the Supreme Court, the waters of the U.S., WOTUS rules, is that our upland first order class 3s are no longer considered federal waters. They are not waters of the U.S. And so there's not a 404 needed for that. Then we got some funding from some state local programs and EQIP programs from NRCS over 2 years to manage 40 acres of the property under forest health with enough for timber, quote, timber stand improvement, although we're not planning to log it as timber. And then there's also oak woodland enhancement, understory ladder fuels with our, quote, follow-up slash. And where they say pile and burn, we piled it in the gullies. They knew that. They couldn't fund us to do that, but we had the permits to do it. And this is a workaround I can help people out thinking with. And then we tooled up for this with our agents of regenerative disturbance regimes. And we, as an education center, work with lots of community groups, colleges, North Bay Conservation Corps groups, an entity called Circuit Riders. But we've mainly focused on working with amazing folks with North Bay Jobs of Justice and now what is known as Resilience Works. And these are immigrant farm workers, many of whom have been exploited in the vineyard industry, who are indigenous peoples from, say, Mexico, Guatemala, who have time immemorial traditional ecological knowledge of managing forests and good fire and doing this work in their own lives, and respecting that knowledge and working with them and doing workforce training. That's a just transition ecological workforce training with these folks. And so we've been working with them for the past couple years, and now they've been working all over, and it's super fun. And I just want to show you some befores and afters and things of what it could look like. So here's one spot. Keep your eye on the live oaks there. This was actually some high schoolers that we worked with. Look at the dog hair thicket on the right. We that day we limbed and thinned it, and then we basically stuffed a part of this channel with a more of a perpendicular, like a beaver dam analog kind of a thing in 2001. We came back 22 years later. The oaks are still there. We re-thinned and limbed it again with that new growth. We added a perpendicular, but then that channel in front that was about 12 feet wide and 4 feet deep has got a gully stuffing treatment with the green gauze underneath and then the layers of green, brown, green, brown, green, brown with heavier stuff on the top. And the video that we have, I'll mention at the end, it really describes that process. Further down in that system, there's different treatments. I don't stuff every damn gully because in fact, I know that this system here, it's bedrock controlled and it holds water late into the season. And I know it to be a place that rough-skinned newts breed. So I controlled the head cut that was filling it in and upgraded that to slow spread and sink. So it leaks later longer up above this so that it can retain water in that pool to help get the baby newts out of there before it does go dry sometime in late summer. And so a lot of this we refer to as our uplandscape is this process-based fuels to flows where we can slow it, spread it, sink it, store it, share it so it leaks later longer so the water's clear, cold, and copious for coho or newts. And these are a series of perpendicular structures where the grade is a little flatter and wider. And there was a historic flood terrace that had been dewatered due to the incision of a central channel. So we gum up the central channel, we gully pack that in a parallel manner. We kick the flows out up onto the surface, spread them out laterally, and we put those perpendicular structures out there to steer it out to the process space width of that system to optimize our speed bumps and retention of water for as long as we can, again, in these upland systems. Part of those permits is they required monitoring photos. So I just wanted to share some images of pre and post as part of what we gave to the government for our monitoring for the permits. So we had one big gully in our northwest corner, and we got after that. And you can see on the left, Jim, he's 6'2", standing in about 5 foot of gully. That's before, and then we pretty much stuffed that whole thing with organic matter. Again, the stuffing is a very methodical process. It starts with the boughs of the green gauze with the tips up, laid in a bed of gauze, and then your different size materials, you're co-mixing, but it's brown, green, brown, green, brown, green. For those who know how to make a compost pile, you should feel like you're confident here. And then the process is when it rains, the water comes with the organic matter, with the nutrients, with the bed load, and we wet that system and kick off the process of composting in situ, which then sets it off such that the adjacent tree roots, especially for us in a coast redwood system, those tree roots immediately grow into this. Basically, it's a vertical hugelkultur system with a subsurface aquaponic irrigation, carbon sequestration, peat bog, water quality enhancing, soil sponge augmenting, salmon saving system of the quote waste that came off the hill slopes, right? Yeah, Hannah here standing kind of waist deep, 3-4 foot into that one. That's all packed and now stored and re-aggrading. Another re-aggradation gully filling structure. You know, those forests on the hill slope look like the dog hair thickets I showed you before. Here's one I kind of showed you where the newt pool was, a couple treatments there. Here's some of those perpendicular structures again, filling the central drainage and spreading the flows. More of that lateral spreading. All that water on the right-hand side, we're trying to get as much standing water for as long as we can out off the side slopes. Classic head cut, a nick point, deeply incised nick point. Erosion runs uphill, so that nick point, as the water falls off the waterfall, does that little Cuisinart rototiller at the base, calves off the head and the sides, so it deepens and widens and deepens and widens, and head cuts go up slope. So you need to treat the nick point, stop that erosion, get the flow to kick out on top of your new stuffed gully brush packing matrix to then upgrade in that location. Another head cut stuffing treatment. These are what I often call my plethodontid perpendicular palaces, which are lungless salamanders that live in them. On the right, you can see all that a graded soil, the fresh dirt from erosion upslope that we still have yet to control the source on because there's a road network there that we're still dealing with. But we trapped it in situ and aggraded it on site instead of delivering it to the creek to kill coho salmon and their spawning gravels. One thing that's really fun, again, as a biologist, is we have these lungless salamanders out here. These are salamanders, they don't breed in the water, they breed on the land. They breathe through their skin. They're in the Plethodontidae family. Slender salamanders on the upper left, the arboreal salamanders, we have ensitinas, we have black salamander, we have native snails. And these folks did this super interesting study about woodland salamanders and the presence of woodland salamanders who eat the muncher crunchers in the invertebrates who break down organic matter too quickly and vent it off as a GHG emissions, a CO2 process, that when you have the trophic cascade web of the top carnivores working in the form of those salamanders, that these forest soils sequestered 179 pounds more carbon per acre because we had those salamanders in that place. And so all the work we're building, all these gully stuffing projects, the perpendicular plethodontid palaces is also creating salamander habitat. And then we finally did some calculations over 4 pilot project gullies, which was just shy of 1,000 feet of channel, which we measured the length, width, and depth of and estimated the volume of organic matter we put in there. And it came out to 75 tons of carbon, which for what it's worth is equal to the amount of Jeff Bezos' 11-minute space flight. That burns 75 tons of carbon. 75 tons is also the lifetime carbon budget for 1 billion people on this planet. So that was just from 10 acres of area at OAC that had already been treated 20 years before. So do the math on 33 million acres that needs to be met and how many thousands of miles of upland gullies there are. And we're talking about the benefit of moving this forward from a GHG reduction place with the possibility of the water quantity rehydration, to the topic of this lecture, opportunity, I think, is yet to be conceptualized. And I would love some of y'all big brain folks to help me come up with some metrics, how we could count that out and use it as a convincing way to get the state to pivot. So I also leave property and go off a lot, and we always collaborate with lots of folks. And this was a workshop up in the Scott River, tributary to the Klamath, where we were doing forest fire fuels for fens, frogs, and flows with indigenous peoples up there, endangered Cascades frog habitat restoration, Darlingtonia fens, beautiful carnivorous plant bogs. We recently did a gully stuffing collaboration with Golden Gate National Recreation Area in the Tennessee Valley down in Marin County. This was all being done with eucalyptus, which they're slowly removing eucalyptus for various reasons as a non-native plant. And it works really well. Eucalyptus stuffs beautifully. I love it. And I've worked a lot with Trout Unlimited, Mendocino Resource Conservation District, training Ukiah Conservation Corps folks on private timberland, Mendocino Redwood Company property funded by Wildlife Conservation Board, to do this work of using roadside fuel clearance for fire work. And again, that slash is not trash. We've been stuffing it in gullies and filling the gully. And here's one where we filled the switch before in the upper left. And the switch is a place where you move upstream and you find yourself at, say, the head of an alluvial fan, of a delta. And if you can, where it may have incised and now it's cut a single threaded channel through the fan, dehydrating the entire fan and delivering sediment downstream. So if you go upstream and strategically fill the switch and turn it off and kick on the anastomosing branching pattern again, you can rehydrate these uplands, which we did. And then we just kept in a fractal way, keeping water up on top of that terrace for as long as possible. Thankfully, this is a paired watershed study with a control watershed and a treatment watershed that's been being monitored by design we're now 4 years in on this. And so some of that data you can see here on the 20, 21, 22 data is the pre-project data of the amount of water below ground or above the surface. And then this area over here was post-project. And you can just see the thickness, the more water we got underground, how much of that was above as surface water for longer as a initial treatment. We have a second year of data that hasn't been worked, and a paper is going to come out of this as to try to convey this as an expression of one venue in this setting, in this situation of rehydrating this part of California. Ultimately, to increase the latency of the discharge to augment in-stream flows for our dry season to support the rearing of salmon, which I told you about in the beginning is one of our limiting factors. There is a whole interesting world out there around the evapotranspiration game. And I know that in the small water cycle and forest ET and rehydrating the atmospheres is really important. And also what we see in our Mediterranean climate that isn't a summer rain dominated system in the coastal zone. And in fact, has more trees than it used to at time. Again, the more trees, fewer forests, but there are lots of small ones, is that the ET rate right now with these rapidly growing overstocked, especially Doug fir dominated systems, is out of whack with the way an old growth forest was and how it has a lower ET and greater groundwater hyperrheic flow to the creeks. And so what we see, it appears as significant, a piece of the puzzle that appears to be exacerbating why our salmonid streams are drying up in our forested landscapes is the overstocking. So the limbing and thinning and gully stuffing to old growth again with fewer trees and more forest to also reduce ET in that area and increase flows is a whole world that a lot of people are looking at. And there's a initial study by some folks. Our regional parks, Sonoma County regional parks have gotten really interested in this idea because they have managed 20,000 acres of parks right now. All of those parks are lands that have been abused and overused and are in need of restoration. And so we've been working with them. I've been doing staff training on this work. Here's a really interesting project. We limbed and thinned this whole area at Monte Rio Redwoods in the Dutchville watershed. And there was a little gully stuffing and an upland trib. It was only about 2 to 3 feet wide and a couple feet deep. It got stuffed and it got forgotten about. And then CAL FIRE with the parks did a 30-acre prescribed burn. And nobody was paying attention to this little seam here. And they just burned it over. And you can see everywhere there the white ash on all sides. But see the unburned area where all the needles and the leaves and the branches in that strip did not burn? That's the gully we stuffed that brought the water up to the surface and created this little mini wetted area that was less flammable and cooler and acted like a baby fire break, if you will. Kind of like how Dr. Emily Fairfax has been her work on Smokey the Beaver, looking at beaver wetted areas for fire breaks. And so I think the nexus again of fuels to flows and trying to understand the flammability or not of these gully stuffing situations, especially after they've had water on them, they begin to compost is I'm waiting for a master student to help me. Another project we did with regional parks was a huge head cut. Kevin on the left, Kevin Swift, Swiftwater Design. We pulled that bridge and the upper central photo is that same spot. So you can see we stuffed 6+ foot of head cut there. And then down at the bottom, there's a big gully stuffing project on that. And then we've just put out a draft of this document with regional parks and Sonoma RCD. That is our low-tech process-based restoration guidance, a BMP manual for upper watersheds. And we're going to eventually publish this and put this out. But it's moving out of the riverscapes like the LTPBR manual. This is basically the LTPBR manual for uplandscapes. And these BMPs, as they get accepted and formalized with the regulators, are going to help us with our permitting process of cutting the green tape to increase this permitting. I do want to reference a website that Sonoma Ecology Center, Pepperwood, and OAC were funded to put together for landowners. And it's in Sonoma County, but I think it's helpful for everybody. And again, it's kind of at some point, my idea is are you on the extractive land use side, you're on the love it, leave it alone side, or are you in the Goldilocks regenerative disturbance regime in the middle? I leave that up to each of you to sort out for yourselves. Community Alliance of Family Farmers has really gotten into this. We've been working a lot of agriculturalists and vineyard folks on gully stuffing. They produced a little quick guide on this. 2 days ago, I just got this email from friends up north, and they used a bunch of our photos, and they're having their own gully stuffing workshop up in Laytonville and Mendocino County, which is really cool. So this is really taking off. And then I want to show this little video here. Atmospheric River 2022. Whoop, whoop, whoop. Happy New Year's, people. This is the Happy New Year. Look at all this water we're holding here. All of our fire fuel load, we put it perpendicular. We're holding the flow. We're ponding it up. One dam all the way. Oh, look at that. Another dam. Channel spanner, reconnecting floodplain barriers. Plugged up the gully here, spread the channel, split the flow. Now we've got two flows. We've got a little island. There used to just be an eroding channel delivering sediment to fill the coho. Look at that. It's going to the bank to bank, all the way across the whole channel. Flow and spread, sinking storage, share it, baby. Let's up. Channel, all the way across. And then gully stuffing with the head cut. This used to be a deeply eroding incised channel delivering sediment to kill coho. Now we're slowing the flow. We've got our nice slash from the fuel mode. It's got slashing trap. It's benefits the biomass on site, stacking functions, water quality, water quantity, carbon, salmon habitat, fire resilient landscapes. Ring it. So if you want to see more of that, there's this NBC news story that featured that work. And we just recently then just launched our new Fuels to Flows campaign. We've got a whole website. We got a ton of resources. We produced these two videos. The one on the left is an 18-minute, very detailed DIY, how to stuff a gully. I don't even know where it's at now, 50, 60,000 views. People are loving it. And then there's a companion, a short 3+ minute animation that's super fun. So have a look at those. I'll stall on this if anybody wants to grab this QR code. But it'll go to this document here, which is like a one-page handout we often give people, but there's links where we kind of make it easy on you to go to some of the specific resources and documents we have on our website around the Fuels to Flows work there. And then, so, I kind of showed you this idea of the Fuels to Flows graphic, but at some point it really links to what I've been calling our beneficial biomass portfolio. And this is like a game board, I think, as for designers and any property owner, that you have your goals, your existing conditions, what you can afford, what's appropriate for your site. And then there's these pieces, if you will, about if you're doing vegetation management. I'm just asking the question to people, can you consider that maybe combustion is not your only option, although combustion has its place, and biochar is amazing, and burn piles are needed, and obviously cultural good fire is really important. But if gully stuffing or lop and scattering or laying it on condor for perpendicular plethodonid palaces, maybe you're chipping it and composting it, or you're doing on-site round pole construction. So there's some firewood in the mix. There's maybe you need to chip and haul it. There's other stuff, some wood resource where people are taking a merchantable log out of that system for board wood or high grading it for value added, but it's at a much smaller level. It's keeping the big trees, using that material in the middle. All the fine stuff is staying on site. So imagine you can use this as your own process, but I just invoking a holistic stewardship framework for people to think about this as it relates to not just rehydrating California, but recarbonizing California and good firing California and re-salmoning California. And then ultimately it's the workforce, the just transition, the resiliency, the community resiliency that we're looking for. And ultimately, for me, the frame being thinking like a conservation hydrologist about receiving, recharging, retaining, and releasing. And if you need to speak truth to power to folks, then dress up in a salmon suit and go to the Board of Supervisors and wear shorts if it's a hot day in Santa Rosa because you're sweating bullets inside that foam suit. And speak on behalf of coho salmon there, which I can tell you was not well received in this event 20 some years ago. So that's what I got for you, and got some time for Q&A, and I'll stop sharing. Ta-da.
Thank you so much, Brock. Wow, lots and lots and lots there. And we've got more people here than when we started. And there was a lot of chat going on. Usually I try to stop the chat because I know those little pop-ups can be hard when you're speaking. But on the other hand, people were putting some interesting resources and questions, so I decided to let it go.
They didn't bother me. I wasn't bothered by them, and I'm happy y'all were doing that. And,
Okay.
yeah. But if there were questions in the chat you want to bring up for me, since I wasn't,
Well, I think
or however you want to.
there was one particular one that that caught my eye about that sort of underbrush and lower vegetation and et cetera, as a habitat. And are we disturbing, and what are we losing when we limb and thin or when we move the brush or that kind of thing? If the person who put the that comment in there wanted to unmute and say more. That I'm not sure if I captured it completely, but
I mean, it's a great question. I can probably take it on. I bet I have a,
yeah,
I
go
mean,
for it. Yeah.
but yeah, it's great. And so again, the opportunity is for you as a designer, you're evaluating your site, the existing conditions, what you think are the reference ecosystem conditions of pre-disturbance and where you would like it to go. And then you manage for your veg management to achieve the goals you want. And if you've determined, like we at OEC have determined, that the retention of thickets of understory shrub habitat, because, for instance, for us, California quail, spotted towhee, cow towhee, they all nest in that habitat. Actually, orange crown warbler gets in there. So there's patches and islands of retained material at different levels. Whether in the understory in the forest is one thing, I didn't show up, but we have a lot of these huckleberry thickets, which we weren't nuking the huckleberry thickets. We were overstory, or we're mingling up in the edge where we get a chaparral, poison oak islands. We get these epic poison oak islands, and they're the best habitat for so many things. So managing for the mosaic, structural, functional, and compositional mosaics. Absolutely.
Yeah. So really, we're going for like a patchwork approach, similar to if you're meadowing or holistic grazing or whatever, where you're not disturbing the same way everywhere, or global.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thanks. Um, okay. Maybe we'll just go in order of folks. Richard.
Yes, thank you. Brock, my question is the animal piece. I know that in the past, in history, we've had a lot of animals that had an effect on the soil and the shrubs. And so we have existing animals, deer, coyotes, all the animals there. But when you bring in goats or sheep, or I don't think you want to bring in grazing in certain wooey areas, but what's your thought on the animals stacking on top of this whole method too at the same time, like working them in?
Yeah, no, I love it. The work of, Alan Savory, holistic management, planned grazing, that again, disturbance, just the idea of disturbance, I think disturbs people, but uh, sunlight disturbs darkness and wind disturbs stillness. So we need to get over our disturbance on that and just recognize you're either a degenerative disturber or a regenerative disturber. And the question is, what are you disturbing? And herbivory, flood, fire, are degenerative and regenerative depending on frequency and intensity. And so animal impact, for instance, which I think has been well shown in rangeland settings when it's done well, holistically, can be regenerative. We know that overgrazing and continuous grazing has other issues. In our space, to be honest with you, we have limbed and thinned a bunch of this forest. And we have a bunch of crown sprouting species, like our tan oak, because we have sudden oak death here, is crown sprouting and dying off and crown sprouting. And we're getting these like salad mix dead thickets underneath. I would, if fire's not going to be used in that setting to kind of clean that up and thin it out and for the health, I would love to bring in 100 goats for a day and a half in that system. And then I get the pee and poo out of that system and then they move on kind of thing. And so I think, again, it's one of these questions. It depends. And if you understand that the disturbance impact of, say, a goat, a sheep, a cow, in the absence of elk and pronghorn and deer in our systems right now, what elk have started to come back to Sonoma County. I mean, elk were the forest managers around here, and Roosevelt elk is what we have here, and that's a forest elk, not like Rocky Mountains or Tules, which is a valley elk. California is the only state that has all three subspecies, by the way, bragging. But Roosevelt's is a forest elk, and those big old antlers, and they got in and they scrape trees and they limb stuff up. So I would love that. But in the absence of enough herbivory pressure of the native ungulates in this moment, which we don't have, bringing an analog in the case of, cows got a different game, bigger hoofed and things. For me in my forest setting, goats is the critter. Sheep isn't as much there, but goats is the critter for me. And we've done some of that already.
Thanks, Brock.
Seeing-
Nadia?
Yeah, hi, thanks. So I apologize in advance. I'm gonna do a little plug here real fast, but I just wanted to say, Brock, this is my first time hearing you talk in probably like 20 years. The first time I heard you talk, inspired me to go to the New College of California. I decided not to, but I ended up majoring in environmental studies and then later went on to get my master's in landscape architecture. And ever since then, I've been thinking about nature-based solutions, thanks to your slow it, spread it, sink it, which you were talking about 20 years ago. And at the time, it was like mind blowing, and now it just feels really intuitive and makes so much sense. So it's really cool being here. So thanks for that. But yeah, I have a couple of questions. Um, the first one sort of being, now I work doing like adjacent landscape management type stuff as an environmental consultant and then also as a landscape designer now. Um, but there are best management practices out there that are very much against putting wood in waterways, which I'm sure you know a lot about. And I have ideas about why that is the case, but I was hoping you could like expand and clarify on like how and when wood is okay. I think a lot of it has to do with creating the wrong kind of disturbance, like gouging and causing erosional issues when trees are being felled into channels versus placed into channels. But I don't know if you wanted to like speak more to that nuance and really if it is just like another cultural thing that we need to get over, just like how fire was slash is. And
Yeah.
then secondly, how are you if you are working on like policies at the state level for like water management and fire shed management and all that? Because I am seeing with more tribes and even Cal Fire, they're getting more finally into mitigation and not just fire suppression. Um, so yeah, two-parter. Thank you.
Well, thanks for that, and fun to see you again after so long. And thanks for the reminder. So I would just say that on the history side, relative to the big question about wood in waterways, if you read any of the original journals, any of the missionaries coming into California, any of the pioneers coming to California, nobody would walk up a river or up a channel because it was so jammed with wood. It was completely jammed up with wood. Dutchbill Creek is named for a guy who wasn't Dutch. He was a Norwegian who jumped ship in the gold mining area and hid out in a wood jam in Marin County for a week to not be found so he could go mine gold. So our channels were so stocked with wood. Our beaches were so loaded with wood. You go in an old growth forest, just go to any old growth forest out there and try to get in the channel. So, and then we systematically de-wooded our beaches, our estuaries, our channels. We cut the wood out. Because creeks and channels were about conveyance and we wanted to reduce flooding. So we killed the beaver and de-wooded the system, set it up to disconnect from its floodplain, to begin the incision and the dewatering and all the erosion because we wanted that conveyance, like a glorified trapezoidal channel when in a perfect setting for urban stormwater channels. And the keeping the wood out the creek. And in the Forest Practice Act, it is illegal to place forest slash in a channel because the legacy of pre-Forest Practice Act and the way logging was being done in a rapacious way did it in a really bad way for the creek and just threw it in there, stomped on it, and messed it up. So the regulation was appropriate in addressing that as an issue that was not being done well in an extractive way. But we're at a moment in time, I think, where we need to cut some green tape from a policy perspective and recognize that there are, by design, intentional opportunities to regeneratively integrate wood back into all order of channel. We're helicoptering wood into estuaries all over the state right now. We're helicoptering big wood, large woody debris, massive wood jams, anchored stuff for salmon restoration throughout in our class ones. And it's like a fractal order. The stream power equation from the top of the watershed is the least to the biggest down in the middle, and then the lowest in the estuary again, and the slow flow. And the proportionate scale and size of the wood is matched to the fractal energy of the stream power equation. And these upland gullies weren't gullies. They were wide or sloping areas of drainages full of wood that were up at the grade where the leaf litter was with whatever shape they had. And as we've dehydrated and incised them, it's a ditch, and we're dewatering our landscapes. So I have yet to meet an upland class 3 that isn't the victim of the increased runoff coefficients, hydraulic mining through especially road concentration and culverts. We're hydraulically mining out our systems. And if you want to rehydrate California, if you can't reconnect all the soil water back up to restore the soil sponge in a 6-foot in size gully on that hill slope, you'll never get the hill slope to hold water because it's like you pulled the plug out of a bathtub, and it'll keep laterally draining the hill slope to whatever the bed elevation of the gully is. It's just physics. It's not that complicated. So the beauty of this is I'm like, let's stuff it, regrade it, create the compost pile, fill it with roots, on behalf of rehydrating the hill slope by slowing the flow and retaining the water. And so the policy piece is, as I showed you those permits, we are filling waters of the state. So we are in the nexus right now, working with Water Board, CDFW, California Natural Resources Agency, ultimately CAL FIRE, Board of Forestry, on a rethink about how can we formalize through these best management practices, which is why we did that booklet, and the permitting, and then the training, so people are trained to do this in a way that the regulators are confident that they can get to a, maybe it's a no permit needed scenario, but a low permit needed scenario to increase the pace and scale of the application across the 30 million acres that we're supposedly need to deal with.
Brooke, I have just a follow-up question from Nadia's. So we're talking about gully stuffing, that there's, I guess the question is, are there cases where you would not want to do something, are there, especially thinking about like fish moving through streams, et cetera, are there, are you thinking about a gully differently than a stream that is kind of a healthy stream? How do you, as people are starting to kind of get oriented to this way of looking at and approaching land, what's that baseline learning that they need to say, is this okay place to intervene or not?
So that's why I showed the watershed drainage network. So everything we're talking about with gully stuffing is where? In the first order class 3s, the uplands. So invoking fish, you don't get to invoke fish because there ain't no fish. It ain't fish habitat. That's the point, right? It goes to where the fish are, and it's delivering dirt to the fish, and it's running off too much water and making the flooding worse, attenuating, ramping up the peak hydrograph, exacerbating the erosion. So in the first order streams, the class 3s, the ephemeral seasonal drainages, that's a set of worldview tactics assessments. I showed you one where I didn't stuff it because there's a bedrock pool that had newts in it. So you still have to be responsive to the micro site conditions of whatever's appropriate. You move down the network into what we call the class 2s, where there may be perennial pools, which that amphibian pool in some ways is a class 2, and how we're interacting with that channel, what wood it needs, what it doesn't need. Is there a floodplain to reconnect? How steep is it? How wide is it? Is it a transport reach? Is it a depositional reach? You got to tune yourself up to your geofluvial morphology pattern language and read the landscape. And then you get down into the class 1s, the big creeks, the rivers, the estuaries, and things just get bigger, and you need more game, you need more understanding, you're dealing with forces that are bigger, and there's lots of big wood going in those. There's lots of work happening in those and other passages. So it's process-based restoration is happening at every scale, and the tools in the toolbox get pulled out proportionate to where you are within the drainage network, and you have to be savvy enough to understand what to apply where.
Thanks, Brock. Ingela and Marius?
Yeah, hello. Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Yeah, calling in from Germany. Also have a drought, the biggest drought since 90 years, I think. And yeah, starting to think about water. Media is going there. And I have two questions. The one question is, when do you use these switches? And the other question is, how can we, or did you maybe already did it? How can we make it a bit more fun to bring this topic, this important topic, into the media? So there's this edutainment where people combine entertainment with education? Do you do anything like this, or yeah, so the switches and the media.
Right. So we call it edutainment. There's education, entertainment is edutainment. So that's your, yeah. So theater, performance, puns, my little memes, these rapid fire little word plays, that kind of stuff, dancing around in the water, getting that on NBC News, which got lots of hits. So I'm certainly doing my best. That's why we made the little animation video for folks who maybe only have 3 minutes of focus and don't want to watch the 18-minute video, but always up for more, how to use social media. I don't know what a gully stuffing TikTok dance looks like, but let's make it up. Let's go viral. You guys figure it out. I love it. Bring it on. As far as switches go, switches again, it's a reading the landscape question. So you're understanding the shape of the channel and the morphology of watersheds and channels is really diverse. And in humid systems, temperate systems, dryland systems, there's a whole field. Christopher Alexander's pattern language book's got some really cool stuff. Chapter 4 in the Permaculture Designer's Manual's got some really cool stuff on pattern language. But switches are places where you tend to be in a lower gradient system, an alluvial fan, a mountain meadow, a historic floodplain where the slope of the channel is lower. So you're not up in the high, fast flowing, rapidy section. And there used to be more lateral flow, what's called anastomose, anabranching, multiple threaded channels, beaver type stuff, oxbow bends. And what you often see is that through the legacy of increasing runoff volume and velocity at some point, often related to roads and culverts, a nick point happened in that system. It created incision, and you end up with a single threaded channel running through the middle of the meadow. And it's been that way for so long because we de-beavered it and then overgrazed it 150 years ago. And everybody thinks that single threaded channels are normal. And it's like, no, they're not normal in a wet meadow, for instance. So we go find those places upstream, and how do we block them up with our process-based restoration strategies, our beaver dam analogs, in such a way that we bring the water up to then laterally reconnect it to these legacy channels, that the memory of the calligraphy of the channel. And that's the switch. It's a place where you turn the water flow on so it can re-enter other channels and reoccupy its historic floodplain or its historic terrace or something like that. So I will just say for you that I know you're in Germany, but Kate Lundquist, who I co-direct Water Suit with, and her partner in life, who also is the owner of Swiftwater Design, Kevin Swift, just spent their second month in France. They did last year a month in France, and they just did a month 2 weeks ago, bringing low-tech process-based restoration. They went to 6 different sites. They trained over 200 folks in France. It is blowing up in France. And so I could connect you up with them. And if you want to catch one of your little URL trains and pop over to France and meet up with the PBR folks over there. They are going for it at scale right now, all over, especially up in the Pyrenees. They're working hard right now with the PBR.
Nice.
Super interesting stuff.
Would be really great, yeah.
You have castor fiber over there. We have castor canadensis. So they also are with the beaver believers over in Europe, which I know you're a beaver believer in Germany. Oh my God, Gerhard, he's the most crazy beaver believer on the planet. I love that guy.
Awesome.
So how can I write you a reminder or something like that?
Yeah, I'll put my email in the chat for everybody right now.
Perfect. Thank you.
Great.
Okay.
Paul and then Rob.
Yes. So for us, in Northern California here, about an hour north of Sacramento, our context is a little different. We're Oak Savanna. So one of the challenges we have is that we're receiving a lot of that water that's channeling and coming down through the watershed into our area. And unfortunately, we also are treated as the same type of fire danger, even though, we're mostly pasture and grassland, which is its own kind of frustration, especially from a management perspective and from an insurance perspective as well. But Maybe you could speak to that a little bit, Brock, because so much of the lower parts of the Sierra are oak savanna, and the other part of this would be historically, um, we would also have huge herds of elk running through where we would be, but would there have been also beavers higher up on those class 3 streams? So would it have been less ephemeral? And is that something that um, well, obviously it's something that we're mimicking through that process, but is are beavers going to show up again in those areas?
Yeah, that's great. Um, so I would just say I could have pointed it out, but one of the early photos I showed you the sequence where I kept saying pay attention to the live oaks and the dog ear thicket. That area technically is an oak savanna for us. We have black oak, white oak, and coast live oak in there, and there's a coastal prairie understory that's been completely swamped out with Doug fir. So I don't think the veg community explicitly has it is what it is. It's just you may not, if it's not being encroached by conifer and or other woody vegetation, then I think what your question is, which is a great question, is what's the organic matter options I have to quote stuff the gully with if I'm not if your oak savanna is intact, other than maybe the grassland community isn't as native as you want it, is maybe as perennial bunch grass euphorbia as you want. Maybe it's got
Right.
white annuals. So you're going to have to get creative and figure out, my neighbor on the north side, who's got the conifer dominated system where white fir or ponderosa pine is maybe a little more aggressive than they want. Maybe there's a trade. Maybe there's an option. I don't know. Trucking and transport's its own world. So I don't have an explicit suggestion for you other than, or you know what? If you got rock, like the folks in the Southwest desert have done incredible things all over the world. People who have rock can do amazing rock structures. So maybe you've got rock. All I'm saying is you just got to, if incision and entrenchment and head cutting and nick points and dehydration because of that is your issue, then if the permaculture brain says, that's my problem, I'm looking for a solution. What are the raw resources I have? What's my on-site resources? What can I achieve? And if I don't have organic matter, do I have rock? I like, you're going to have to solve for that. But however you solve for the opportunity to mitigate the nick point, reduce the incision, upgrade the system, and address whatever the root cause is upstream, maybe, which probably is a road with a culvert that's driving the incision. I bet if I was a gambling person, I'd put $20 on that. I love reading a crystal ball with people and walking up their gully and betting them $20 that there's a culvert up. No, 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 no. I'm like, yeah, right. Let's go find the road. A road is involved here somewhere, I bet you. Um, um, and then I think the cool thing about oak savanna is it's a lot easier to burn in the right season, in the right moment, with a cool, fast moving, low fire in that system. Maybe you're helping to save native bunch grasses so that when you post burn, you're sowing in your purple needle grasses, your Elemis blue wild rise kind of stuff up there. You might have some melicas in that system, and pushing it as you upgrade the system to hold more water. You're also getting those deep rooted bunch grasses in your savanna while trying to maintain that canopy closure of your oaks. You're probably mostly black oak up there, right?
No, we're mostly blue oak right now.
Oh, right. Oh, you're even lower down. Oh,
Yeah,
look.
we're
Wow.
like
Yeah,
400 feet.
you're
Yeah,
you're
blue oak,
super.
live oak, and some white oak scattered around where it's wetter.
For the non-Californians here, right? The whole game here. So yeah, blue oak is that's even lower down and even drier and more threatened, and a good fire in a blue oak savannas, and could be a really good thing with those grasses. So yeah, you start hunting for your material and figure out your fire thing and then size it and yeah, do that. I don't know. You just got to figure it out. Um, I love wood chips as a matrix. If I've got rough material, I'll use wood chips. Or if I need green gauze, we've scythed or weed-eated meadows at the end of the year. And then instead of green gauze, we laid down basically straw gauze, like thatch gauze from that. If we had then the rough woody chunks, like if there was a dead oak or an oak fell over and you're making firewood out of the trunk, but all the tops and everything, you start cutting those up into little mini like kindling size things. And you're going to have to come up with a grass thatch oak top, like kindling combo that you're going to jam in there. But your goal is it needs to be compact and dense. It can't be Swiss cheesy. It has to adhere to the bed of the gully. Water can't get under it. Water can't go around it.
Yeah, we've done a little bit of that along with revetments for the when the creeks are like busting out of their sides.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
been really useful too.
Right.
Mm.
Great.
Go
Thanks,
to
Bob.
go. Love our
Thank
blue.
you.
All right. You got time for one or two more, Brock?
I do. Yeah.
Okay, we got to hear from Rob here. Rob.
Hi, thanks, Dee Dee. Thanks, Brock. I just love what you're doing. It's just fascinating to me, particularly because I've been working against the Fix Our Forest Act. And they use a lot of years the same language that you use, um, and also some of the same principles. So you're causing me to become much more nuanced in how I approach this, and realizing that some of the people who support this act have some kernels of good thinking, right? About forests getting too crowded and kind of being disturbed and in this really kind of state where they need some help. So I'm
Yeah.
just wondering if you can tell me a little bit about your thoughts about the Fix Our Forest Act, um, how I can better fight it in the time that remains. And if you have any thoughts about, because you're so good with language, trying to differentiate your language from their language. Because when I hear you use their language, it's a little disorienting, like health restoration, all these terms that sound good and are good when you're doing it, but not so good when it's the U.S. Forest Service.
Yeah. Yeah, I just saw pop up in the chat. The work that Chad Hansen's doing and others on John Muir Project and Smokescreen are. So I'm with you. I feel it, and so thinning. It's funny. So like the word thinning has been so appropriated and abused now by the plunderers because they were looking for that euphemism. And so we know how greenwashing works, right? There's always a kernel of truth in that greenwashing moment, and then they appropriate the like cultural appropriation. They appropriate the wording, the phrase that had a kernel of truth to it, but then as we witness their application of their disingenuous application of it is we're up against just a bunch of liars, right? Who are just and so the other one is biomass, and that's why I'm putting beneficial biomass in front, because the other part of this work of the quote Fix Our Forest Act is they what do they want to fix? They just want to increase the cut baby cut. And then what do they want to do with that? It's either going to the mill, or they're going to get green and reduce carbon emissions by making a pellet plant out of this for green energy, or they're going to have a biomass plant where they're just going to feed it into some biomass burner to make steam or electricity, blah, blah, blah. And they're going to centralize that. And then what you basically witness is it's just another excuse, one more in a long litany of excuses to clear cut our forest, to extract all the resource, to take it away from the site, leave nothing on the site, plunder it, all of that stuff. And so words like biomass, words like thinning, health, and as you've heard, I'm trying to stand in the face and argue etymologically with people about a regenerative expression of quote thinning or beneficial biomass, which is keep on site to fulfill all the ecological, hydrological, geosoil, biodiversity needs of the site with that organic matter on site as beneficial biomass. That description stands wholly in contrast with, I think, the Fix Our Forest folks, although, like you said, they're squirrely. So I don't, boy, yeah, we're all of us at every turn with this current administration and the sycophants, lackeys in the Congress who are quote lawmakers, who are writing this. We're up against calling BS on that, but they're slipping it in. They're going to get it passed, and then it's going to be what does it look like on the ground and how. But they also want to remove our ability to participate in logging reviews. They want to get rid of local capacity to comment or to protest that, right? Because they're trying to get rid of all the barriers that they've been annoyed with for years with regulations like the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, that they found got in their way from just wholesale plundering. And so it's an activist moment. It's a clarity moment. To be honest with you, have dusted off my original version of the Eco Defense Manual from my Earth First days in the 80s. And my old age here, I'm feeling a little strident in my return that Hey Duke lives. We may need to get there with all our national forests again because they're coming for us. And I don't have any help other than, yeah,
Quite like hell.
I think, and try our best if you can influence the act. But it's like, what are the language in the act that describes the performance expression of what success looks like, so that there's a criteria that you could judge the project on that holds them to a criteria if in fact there was observation and enforcement at the end of the project. But if there isn't going to be any enforcement because we basically just defunded and depopulated all of the regulatory folks, right? We're firing everybody in these agencies. We're filling them with lackeys, and we're putting wiggle words up on the front end of this thing. And we're going to limit public comment and response on the plan when the saws and the dozers run in your national forest. We're rid. Like our body, the Chipko movement's going to have to show back up. I don't mean to go that way, but that's where I'm feeling right now. I'm super,
Yeah.
super exasperated at the federal level. But what I've been mostly is what on public land, it's like public land grazing, public forest. It's like, oh no, the whole capture by industry of our public lands and the enclosure of the commons and privatization, in essence, corporatization of those is its thing. Sonoma County's 97% privately owned. All of our forests are privately owned and they're small owners. The average is 20 acres, 40 acres. So the work we're doing over here in this zone where there is no federal land is all with private property. It's non-industrial, it's non-extractive. There's some timber harvest plans here and there for the most part. So it's really distinguishing between non-commercial and commercial, public, private, industrial extraction or not. I mean, there's some other variables about that. I don't know. Maybe
Thanks,
science will
Rob.
prevail.
Yeah.
Maybe it will. I hope
I
so.
think this is so much of what someone used the word nuance earlier, and I think this is so much what we need to do here is to find that zone, that's in the middle. I was saying I'm working with a dog trainer, saying how do we shift from being either a potato or a raging maniac to have all this other space in between of what our nervous systems are doing. And I think the same thing is true with our policy, with our understanding, with our language. I know I can see you're trying to hold something up, but
I'm
I
trying to tell you
can't.
my eco defense manual that I want to get, but this pesky anyway.
Oh, you maybe put it in the chat or, oh, okay, there we go.
I'm just showing you the cover.
Yeah, it's not a,
I need that book. Anyway.
is that downloadable?
No, this is a
Ancient and dog-eared.
full guide to monkey wrenching with edited forward
Oh,
by
maybe
Dave
turn it into
Foreman.
a PDF and throw it up on the website.
You all can go look at it and find it. It's out there.
It is, okay, great. Rob, I just wanted to invite you if there is something particular that you think, because I know that it's in the Ag Committee, the Senate Ag Committee right now, the Fix Our Forests Act. Is there something particular that you think would be useful for folks to do today?
Well, the legislators in California are really key, and I imagine there's a lot of California folk here. So, you have an outsized influence if you can, do the thing of writing and pressuring your senators and congressmen to oppose this thing. Letters to the editor. In terms of language, I like what you said, Brock. I think we need to defend the language in its truth and change their language on them, because when they say forest health, they don't mean it. And when they say restoration, they don't mean it. So that's been clarifying. But for people to oppose this, people in California, Wild Earth Guardians has very good information on this. So that would be a place to contact. You can go to my website at theclimateaccordingtolife.com .substack.com, where I've been writing on this, and we'll
Yeah,
try
if
to
you're
write
not
more.
reading Rob's articles, he's got a lot of great stuff on thinking in wholes and the history of how we lost, we lost a whole view of how life works and how climate works, et cetera. Really highly recommend that.
Now, the question to them is they're proposing antibiotic ideas and we're probiotic, right? Is
Yeah.
pro-life in the truest sense of all of life, of all
Mhm.
species for all time, beyond just the unborn hominids, or not? And for us in California, I can say I just went to our representative in the North Bay, Jared Huffman. He's now not the chair, but he's the ranking member on the Natural Resources Committee in a Congress where, the Republicans control it. So on the Democrat side, and Jared Huffman, I think, is a great ally in this. And I see Christina put in there that Padilla co-sponsored it, which is a little bit disconcerting, it sounds like. So we need to, but at the Senator, Padilla's at senator level, but at the House side, Huffman, I think, is a really strong ally to work with. And he was railing on this thing the other day at our environmental breakfast in Marin County. So I know he's trying to track and do his best. But as we know, if we lose the midterms, game over, people. So at some point, all of us better figure out how to regain at minimum the House in the midterms. If we want to be really I hate to play politics there, but if we want to be strategic, as long as they're running the House, the Senate, they got the presidency, and the Supreme Court clearly there are no checks and balances. And so we got a year and a half to get back the midterms, or else.
And just, yes, we are at a very, very, very particular confluence with a lot of power. This is not a single party issue. Like some of this language, some of these programs, et cetera, were all happening under other administrations as well. So it's not like, oh, okay, if we can do that, then we're all set. This is a long haul, as you have been in it for so long. It's a long haul attempt for people to understand how living systems work. Many people on this call that I'm looking at have been doing this work for decades. And I thank you for your work, and apologies for the pit bull in the background. I'm digging through my wood pile, looking for some beneficial biomass that she can compost instead of going in the wood stove. And I just want to invite folks also, landandleadership.org. If you go on there, there are many other courses and things coming up. We have something called the Land and Leadership Development Community that meets every week to have conversations more about how we think and how we upgrade our projects and our policies, et cetera. Some of you are in that community already. And we're doing a series of retreats. I would actually love to get you or Kate out here to do one that is on the process-based restoration. So let's talk, because Vermont, we got gullies and uplands and lowlands, and we got it all here.
Everybody, I just gullies on my 5th continent back in December in India. So gullies are a global epidemic. Every terrestrial site that's got a slope that's been uplandly deranged has a gully. If people want to really trip out on this, read a book called Forest Journey by John Perlin. If the folks in this group have not read that book, you all need to just get it. How the role of wood in the development of civilization, or something like that's the subtitle. And he's got these incredible maps, starting with the Sumerians, Fertile Crescent, Tigris-Euphrates Delta, 10,000 years ago, Gilgamesh, and then the Phoenicians, the Cypriots, the Mycenaeans, the Cedars of Lebanon. And it's just clear cut the watershed, dehydrate the sucker, lose the big mass that you need for ships, and then go conquer the next one because of the maritime game. And he's got these shoreline drawings, like where they rolled up with the Trojan horse back in the day in that moment. He draws the shoreline then, and then he draws a comparative shoreline now, and it's like 3 miles away because of all the sedimentation from the upland, loss of soils that dehydrated that Mediterranean, which was a forest, and now we just think of it as rosemary and rocks, right? So it's the magnitude of, and half that book's about North America. It's a really good read in that vernacular about what we're up against here. It's super inspiring. Ultimately, for me, it's like slow it, spread it, sink it, stuff it, share it.
Awesome. So I'm hoping that Brock and Kate are going to do another workshop sometime later this summer, maybe in June or July, on their journey of power mapping around beaver restoration and beaver policy. And thank you all for contributing whatever you contributed to be here. We are not funded by anyone other than the people attending. And so I really appreciate being able to just deliver something that matters and have people cover the cost of doing that. So appreciate that from every single one of you. All right. Anything else, Brock, that you want to say before we close up, or places you want to point people, or things people want to throw in the chat? This recording will be available. I will put it on Substack, as well as it'll be in the same place where you signed up. If you want to share it with folks, I think it will also likely go onto YouTube. The chat you can save, since there's a lot of great stuff in there. It should be, let's see, yes, everyone can save it, I believe. It will be along with the recording. If you go into the chat, there's 3 little tiny dots up in the upper right-hand corner, and one option there is to save the chat.
No, I don't have anything else to say other than
Okay,
deep
all right.
gratitude for everybody who's showing up, all of you guys who are doing your work in your communities, where you are, kicking butt. It takes more than a village, you know, it takes all of us. And yeah, let's just bring some sanity and ecological integrity and reality to the dirt under the nails regenerative work we're all doing here, and call bullshit on the plunderers once again.
Thank you so much, Brock. Really
Right.
wonderful
All right, y'all.
presentation. Great discussion. Bye-bye.
All right.